most of us have probably never heard of the Indian Ocean Dipole or the Southern Annular Mode. But these two climate patterns help shape Australia's weather and are partially responsible for this season's terrible bushfires and the record-breaking drought. The good news is these climate patterns are finally moving into neutral territory. To explain just exactly what that means, I'm joined by Dr Andrew Watkins. He's the Manager of Climate Prediction Services at the Bureau of Meteorology. Good morning.
Good morning, Kathy.
Now, most people, of course, and most Australians would certainly be familiar with El Niño and La Niña weather patterns by now. Many of us probably aren't too familiar with these other two, Indian Ocean Dipole and Southern Annular Mode. Can you give us a bit of a layman's explanation of what these are?
I'll certainly do my best, Kathy.
Good luck.
So for simplicity, we'll call them the IOD, the Indian Ocean Dipole, and SAM, the Southern Annular Mode. That's what the climatologists call them. Look, the IOD is simply, or at least the positive IOD, positive phase IOD, is a bit like El Niño, but over in the Indian Ocean. El Niño is a Pacific Ocean thing. The IOD is an Indian Ocean thing. And basically the warm water moves away from Australia towards Africa and takes the weather with it. And they've had floods, they've had landslides, and there's unfortunately been quite a large loss of life over in the Horn of Africa this year that we haven't probably heard much about. But we have the opposite effect, and we have drought and unfortunately increased fire potential and bad fire conditions. Pretty typical of a positive IOD.
Okay.
And then
what about SAM?
Yeah, the SAM, the Southern Annular Mode, we've had a negative phase of SAM. And what that means is that our weather systems have been further north than normal. And that's what's been bringing all those westerly winds into Sydney and Canberra and right up into southeast Queensland in particular. At the same time, kept things really hot, those westerly winds coming from the interior, coming from the desert, dry, hot, really bad fire weather. The flip side for Tassie, Western Tassie has been cooler and wetter, so they westerly winds there, and that's all been driven by warming in the stratosphere high above Antarctica, and that started way back in about September, October, and that's been driving this negative SAM pattern that brings the bad fire weather.
And so these two are working together to create what we're now experiencing in Australia. I think Darwin's being sort of put up as a good example, or the top end is being put up as a good example or an obvious example of the strong influence of these two patterns. Is that right?
Oh, you're getting into even more complexity there, Kathy. But essentially, yes. Look, we can't ignore the third climate driver, or even the fourth climate driver. The fourth climate driver is our natural seasonal variability, hotter in summer, cooler in winter, and so on. And the other one, of course, is the long-term trends in our weather that we've seen, a drying out of 10 to 15% in southern Australia and a warming up of a degree over the past century for the continent. And certainly up in Darwin, yes, we've seen 21 days over December above 35 degrees. Now, their normal is a bit over 1 in December, and their record was 9 days over 35. So Darwin's been really feeling the effect of effectively the monsoon being kept away by that positive Indian Ocean Dipole, by that positive IOD, and that's kept the monsoon. It was very late to leave India, about 6 weeks late to leave India, very late to come into the southern hemisphere, and the monsoon's still not quite there. And, gee, it must be tough in Darwin. 35 degrees.
Oh well, the build-up is always really tough, so a hotter than normal build-up must be unbearable.
Yeah, it must be very difficult. But of course, these big drivers now are starting to ease away, and that's a good sign.
So this, as I said in the introduction, these patterns are shifting into a more neutral phase. What does that actually mean?
Well, basically, we're starting to see that Indian Ocean pattern with warm water near Africa and cooler water near us. It's starting to ease back to more normal temperatures across the Indian Ocean, or rather a bit warmer than normal everywhere, rather than warmer near Africa, cooler near Australia. And the SAM, well, that negative Southern Annular Mode, that negative SAM pattern has now died off. partly because the warming above Antarctica has now gone away. It's gone back to normal. Now our SAM's going back to normal, so our weather patterns hopefully will start to ease a bit back towards normal. But then you hit the seasonal cycle, which is hot and dry at this time anyway.
And how long will the impacts of these two patterns linger? As we're going into a more neutral phase, what's the phase out into that particular point?
Yeah, well, as we head further into January, really, those impacts will reduce almost completely. We're expecting both to go back to fairly close to normal, a little bit more positive staying with the IOD, but look, both of them head back to normal. Our weather patterns should ease back to normal. But of course, normal these days, I mean, it does tend to be a bit drier and warmer in southern parts of Australia. And likewise at this time of year, hot and dry for southern Australia. Hopefully we'll see the monsoon kicking in across the north and giving a bit of relief soon as well.
So these two patterns have obviously long influenced Australia's weather. Is there an element around climate change as well?
Well, we think, climate change sits underneath all our weather these days. It's not really something our climate or our weather can avoid now. Certainly with the IOD, we think that it's going to become more frequent that we'll have these positive IOD patterns. A bit like we think possibly El Nino may be more frequent and a bit stronger as well. In terms of the SAM, though, a little bit less clear that we'll have more negative SAM patterns like we've had now. In actual fact, the long-term trend has been for more positive SAM, so for our weather systems to be further south than normal. And that's partly why southern Australia has been drier the last couple of decades, because those fronts and those low-pressure systems that tend to bring the rainfall to southern Australia have actually, in general, moved south. But this has been a movement north of our weather systems, and that's really what's brought the bad fire weather more recently.
Okay, well, it's complex science, but you've managed to explain it to us very clearly, and that's no mean feat. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Look, it's a pleasure, Kathy.
Dr. Andrew Watkins is the Manager of Climate Prediction Services at the Bureau of Meteorology.